Under the amber hush of evening, when the prairie grass swayed like tired hymns and the horizon bled into fire, Clara Mayfield stood on her porch with flour clinging to her sleeves. The world had grown quiet since her husband was lowered into the red earth 2 years past, and silence had become both her curse and her shield. Folks in town knew her as the young widow with soft eyes and a mouth that rarely opened, except to murmur a price for a pie or to whisper grace before meals. Yet beneath her stillness, there was a hunger she never confessed, a hollow space where warmth had once lived. The wind teased her black dress as though it remembered what she had lost, and for a moment she thought she heard laughter carried in the dust. She closed her eyes, but the sound slipped away, leaving only the ache of solitude and the smell of bread cooling on the sill. Clara had learned to trade silence for survival. When Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the innkeeper with a tongue sharp enough to peel bark, whispered that Clara was a pretty shadow, but shadows don't keep a man's house warm, Clara only smiled faintly and returned to her stove. When Sheriff Amos Klein looked at her with pity, his gaze heavy as the iron star on his chest, she lowered her eyes and ladled stew for his supper. Shame was easier to swallow than arguments, and silence often cost less than words. Yet silence was not emptiness, it was her way of enduring. She spoke with her cooking instead, filling bellies with kindness she could not voice, though few bothered to notice the devotion needed into every loaf, or the patience simmered into her soups. Still, the loneliness gnawed at her ribs, sharp and restless, as though the body itself remembered she was not meant to live in quiet forever. The first time Silas McGraw appeared, the sun had nearly slipped behind the cottonwoods. He came on a chestnut horse, the beast's breath smoking in the cool dusk, his silhouette cut sharp against the fading light. He carried the weariness of long trails on his shoulders, dust clinging to his boots, and though he was not old, the road had carved his face with the kind of lines that spoke of hard miles and harder silences. He paused at her gate, hand resting on the saddle horn as though uncertain whether to approach or ride on. Clara stood motionless, her hands folded before her apron, aware of the sudden quickening of her pulse. For an eternity he remained there, a stranger framed in twilight, and then he dismounted without a word, tying his reins to the post. When he lifted his hat in greeting, his eyes met hers, gray as storm clouds, steady but searching. She wanted to speak but found her throat dry. Instead she stepped back, leaving the door open. Inside, the lamplight softened the rough edges of his presence. He removed his gloves with careful fingers as though every gesture carried weight. Clara busied herself at the stove, setting bread and stew on the table, though her hands trembled as she poured the coffee. He sat without asking, as though guided by some unspoken understanding, and when he tasted the food he closed his eyes briefly, like a man remembering something long forgotten. "Smells like home," he said at last, voice low and gravelly, words shaped by restraint rather than habit. Clara startled at the sound. It was the first voice to breach her kitchen since her husband's passing. She managed only a faint nod, though her chest stirred with something she could not name. He left coins by the plate when he finished, silver catching the light before he slipped back into the night. The next evening he returned. No announcement, no explanation, just the scrape of boots on her porch and the quiet knock of knuckles against the frame. Clara let him in without question, and again he ate in silence, save for the creak of his chair and the gentle clink of his spoon. Night after night it became a rhythm. His arrival with the dusk, her hands setting food before him, the room holding more presence than words could supply. Yet in the quiet she began to notice him, not the broad shoulders or the weathered hands alone, but the way his eyes softened when he lifted the cup she poured, or how he lingered by the door after the meal, reluctant to leave though he spoke nothing of it. She caught herself waiting for the sound of hooves, and when it did not come, her heart sagged with an ache sharper than she expected. It did not take long for the town to notice. At the market Mrs. Holloway leaned close to whisper, "The widow's feeding more than soup to that cowboy, mark my words." Sheriff Klein's gaze grew heavier each time he passed, as though judgment itself carried weight enough to bow his spine. Clara endured it quietly, cheeks flushed as if she carried a secret shame she had not earned. Each word sharpened her solitude, and though Silas said nothing, she saw the tension settle across his shoulders when he overheard the mutters outside her door. One night after the meal, he rose abruptly, jaw tight, and left without his usual pause at the threshold. She stood staring at the empty chair, its absence echoing louder than any insult she had borne. Days stretched long without him. The bread grew stale, the pot of stew went cold before being eaten. Clara found herself setting the table for two out of habit, then flushing in embarrassment at her own foolish hope. She wandered her kitchen aimless, listening for footsteps that never came, until the silence pressed so heavily she could no longer bear it. At last, with trembling lips, she whispered into the empty room, "I can cook, but I cannot live alone again." The words startled her as though someone else had spoken them, fragile and raw, carried into the dark corners of her home where they clung like prayer. On the fourth night, just as she banked the fire, she heard footsteps crunch against the porch boards. At first she thought she imagined them, a cruel trick of yearning, but then came the hesitant rap at her door. Her breath caught. When she opened it, Silas stood there, hat in hand, eyes shadowed but intent. He looked as though the world had pressed him flat and still he had chosen to rise. His voice was rougher than she remembered when he said, "I left, 'cause they spoke cruel of you. I thought maybe you'd rather I stay gone." Clara felt the weight of years press against her chest, but she steadied her breath and found a voice she had nearly forgotten. "I don't talk much, sir," she said softly, her words trembling yet sure. "But I can cook. And I can stay." Her hands fidgeted with her apron, but her gaze held his, unflinching for the first time in years. The silence that followed was not the old, empty kind. It was full, brimming, alive with the possibility of something unspoken. Silas stepped forward, closer than before, his shadow folding into hers. He set his hat aside, rough fingers brushing hers as though by accident, though they lingered just long enough to make her shiver. His voice dipped to a whisper that trembled against her ear, "I picked you as my wife." The wind sighed through the cracks of the house, carrying not the voices of the dead but the tender promise of two souls who had long forgotten how to belong. Clara closed her eyes and leaned into him, silence breaking not in declarations but in the quiet grace of surrender. What the town thought no longer mattered. She was no longer just a widow, she was a woman seen, chosen, alive again in the hush of a cowboy's whisper. And though their future was unwritten, it was theirs to carve against the endless prairie sky. Some loves arrive not in thunder but in the gentle offering of bread across a table, in the courage of silence shared and understood. Remember this, dear soul. The world will test your worth with cruel words, but the truth of love is often found in the smallest gestures, the quietest moments. Listen closely, for sometimes the only words that matter are whispered at dusk, steady and certain as a promise kept forever. For even now, when the prairie wind stirs and the lamps flicker low, I hear him still, his voice rough and tender carrying through the years, "I picked you as my wife."